Hello, friends, and welcome back to Compelling Stories for a Dinner Party. I'm your host, Christopher James, and tonight we explore the days when women were committed against their will and declared insane simply because they did not agree with their husband or society's ideas of womanhood. It's the story of Elizabeth Packard and the Jacksonville Insane Asylum. In the mid-19th century, America was a land of rigid social structures and unyielding gender roles. Women were expected to conform, to be obedient wives and mothers, and to leave the matters of law, religion, and intellect to their husbands. But not every woman was content with this prescribed role, and for some, defiance came at a very heavy cost. Elizabeth Packard was one such woman, a well-educated and strong-willed individual who found herself on a collision course with the societal norms of her time. Married to a strict Calvinist minister, Theophilus Packard, Elizabeth was expected to submit to her husband's authority in all things. But Elizabeth had her own mind, and she was not afraid to use it. Her independent thinking and religious beliefs, which increasingly diverged from her husband's, made her a target in a world that allowed men near total control over their wives. In 1860, Elizabeth's refusal to conform to her husband's expectations led to a devastating betrayal. Under the laws of Illinois, Theophilus had the legal right to have his wife committed to an insane asylum without a public hearing, based solely on his word. Citing her religious views and independent spirit as evidence of her insanity, Theophilus exercised this power, and Elizabeth was forcibly removed from her home and placed in the Jacksonville Insane Asylum. But Elizabeth Packard was not a woman to be easily silenced. What followed was a battle not just for her freedom, but for the rights of all women in a society that saw them as little more than property. Elizabeth's story is one of courage, resilience, and an unyielding fight against an oppressive system, a story that would echo far beyond the walls of the asylum that sought to contain her. To understand the gravity of Elizabeth Packard's situation, we must step back in time and examine the world in which she lived, a world where the legal and social frameworks were heavily skewed in favor of men, particularly husbands. In the mid-19th century, American society was deeply patriarchal. Women had few legal rights, and their identities were largely subsumed under those of their husbands. Marriage laws were particularly harsh. A husband was considered the head of the household, with near absolute authority over his wife and children. In many states, including Illinois, where Elizabeth lived, this authority extended to a man's ability to have his wife committed to an insane asylum without the need for a trial or public hearing. All it took was the testimony of the husband, often supported by a compliant physician, to declare a woman legally insane and have her confined. Elizabeth Packard was born into this oppressive environment in 1816. Intelligent and curious, she was well educated for a woman of her time, attending school until the age of 18. She married Theophilus Packard, a Calvinist minister, in 1839. The couple had 6 children together, and by all outward appearances, theirs was a typical marriage. But beneath the surface, there were significant tensions. Elizabeth's education and independent nature led her to question many of the religious doctrines her husband preached. She began to develop her own theological views, which increasingly diverged from Theophilus' strict Calvinist beliefs. These differences created a rift in their marriage, as Theophilus grew increasingly intolerant of Elizabeth's dissenting opinions. For a woman to openly disagree with her husband, especially on matters of religion, was seen as both improper and dangerous. To Theophilus, Elizabeth's independent thinking was not just a personal affront, it was a sign of madness. It was in this context that Theophilus Packard made the fateful decision to exercise his legal power over his wife. Rather than engage in dialogue or seek a compromise, He chose to silence Elizabeth in the most absolute way possible, by declaring her insane and having her committed to an asylum. But Elizabeth Packard was not insane. She was a woman ahead of her time, challenging the status quo in a society that was not ready to hear her voice. What followed her commitment would become a landmark case in the fight for women's rights and mental health reform, a battle that would push the boundaries of what was legally and socially acceptable and ultimately change the course of history. The day Elizabeth Packard was committed to the Jacksonville Insane Asylum marked the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. It was a day like any other, but for Elizabeth, it would become the moment when her world was forcibly turned upside down. The process was alarmingly swift. The laws at the time allowed husbands to commit their wives to asylums with minimal evidence and almost no oversight. All it took was Theophilus's word, supported by the testimony of a physician who was likely influenced by the social norms of the day. Elizabeth's protests were ignored. Her voice was drowned out by the authority of her husband and the system that upheld his power. When Elizabeth arrived at the asylum, she was greeted not with care and compassion, but with cold indifference and institutional rigidity. The asylum, like many others of the time, was a place where the boundaries between treatment and punishment were blurred, and where the primary goal was often control rather than cure. Elizabeth was now labeled as insane, a diagnosis that carried with it a heavy stigma and justified the loss of all her rights. Her opinions, her beliefs, and her very identity were now seen as symptoms of her madness. Inside the asylum, she was no longer Elizabeth Packard, the educated, articulate woman who had challenged the norms of her society. She was simply a patient, a case number in a system designed to silence her. The diagnosis of insanity was particularly dangerous in Elizabeth's case because it was based not on any true mental illness, but on her husband's desire to control her and suppress her dissent. In the 19th century, the concept of madness was often applied to women who stepped outside the boundaries of what was considered acceptable behavior. Independent thinking, especially when it contradicted a husband's views, was frequently pathologized and used as a pretext for confinement. For Elizabeth, this was not just a loss of freedom, it was an existential threat. The asylum was a place where many women were sent, never to return. But Elizabeth Packard was determined to survive, and more than that, she was determined to fight back. She knew that she was not insane, and she refused to let the system break her. Her time in the asylum would be a test of her resilience, but it would also be the beginning of a struggle that would change not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who faced similar injustices. Inside the cold, unyielding walls of the Jacksonville Insane Asylum, Elizabeth Packard faced a harsh and dehumanizing reality. The asylum was not a place of healing, but a place of control, where those deemed mentally ill were often subjected to treatment methods that were as cruel as they were misguided. Upon her arrival, Elizabeth was stripped of her identity. She was no longer recognized as an intelligent and articulate woman, but was reduced to a mere patient, a number in the eyes of the institution. The asylum's regime was strict and unforgiving. The women confined there were expected to conform to the institution's rules without question, and any sign of defiance was quickly suppressed. Elizabeth was confined to a small, barren room, cut off from the outside world. Her only company was the cold, hard walls and the echoing silence that filled the corridors. The isolation was oppressive, designed to break the will of the patients and force them into submission. For Elizabeth, the solitude was suffocating, but she refused to let it crush her spirit. The treatments administered in the asylum were often more about control than care. Patients were subjected to various forms of physical and psychological torment under the guise of therapy. Elizabeth witnessed and endured the use of physical restraints, where women were tied down to prevent them from moving freely, as if their very independence was a threat to the institution. The use of moral treatment, often meant forced compliance with arbitrary rules, and any division was met with punishment. Elizabeth's greatest challenge, however, was the constant threat to her sanity. She knew that if she allowed the conditions of the asylum to break her, she might never regain her freedom. But Elizabeth was determined to resist. She began to meticulously document her experiences, recording the daily abuses and inhumane conditions she witnessed. These writings became her lifeline, a way to maintain her sense of self and to gather evidence for the battle she knew she would eventually fight. Despite the oppressive environment, Elizabeth's sharp mind remained intact. She observed the other women around her, many of whom had been committed for reasons as unjust as her own. Women whose only crime was to defy societal norms or to assert their independence. These observations further fueled her resolve to expose the injustices of the asylum system. The asylum staff, particularly the male doctors and attendants, viewed Elizabeth's resistance as further proof of her insanity. Her refusal to submit to their authority was seen as a sign of her delusion, and they tried to break her spirit through increasingly harsh measures. But Elizabeth was unyielding. She knew that her fight was not just for herself, but for all the women who had been silenced and stripped of their rights. As the months turned into years, Elizabeth's determination never wavered. She held on to the belief that she would one day be free and that she would bring to light the injustices she and so many others had suffered. Her time in the asylum was a crucible, forging in her a resolve that would become unstoppable once she was released. But first, she had to find a way out, and that would require a battle unlike any she had ever faced. After 3 long years of confinement in the Jacksonville Insane Asylum, Elizabeth Packard's situation took a dramatic turn. Despite the institution's efforts to break her spirit, Elizabeth's resilience and determination had not faltered. Her chance for freedom came not through the compassion of her husband or the asylum staff, but through the growing awareness among the asylum's trustees that something was terribly wrong with her case. The trustees who periodically reviewed the cases of patients began to take note of Elizabeth. Unlike many of the other women in the asylum, she showed no signs of insanity. Her intelligence and clarity of thought stood in stark contrast to the diagnosis that had kept her locked away. These trustees, perhaps motivated by a sense of justice or discomfort with the blatant misuse of power, decided to investigate further. In 1863, after reviewing her case, the trustees concluded that Elizabeth was not insane and had been wrongly committed. They ordered her release. But this was only the beginning of her fight. Upon returning home, Elizabeth faced a new form of imprisonment, this time at the hands of her husband, Theophilus Packard. Theophilus, still determined to control his wife, locked her in a room in their home, claiming it was for her own safety. But Elizabeth, empowered by her recent experiences, refused to be silenced any longer. She knew that the only way to truly regain her freedom was to take legal action against her husband and the system that allowed her wrongful confinement. Elizabeth managed to escape her husband's clutches and filed for a writ of habeas corpus, a legal action that challenged her unlawful confinement. The case was brought before a jury in a highly publicized trial that captured the attention of the nation. This was not just a trial about one woman's sanity. It was a trial that questioned the very laws of societal norms that allowed such an injustice to occur. In the courtroom, Elizabeth Packard displayed the same strength and clarity that had sustained her during her years in the asylum. She testified on her own behalf, presenting the meticulous records she had kept during her confinement. Her testimony was powerful and compelling, painting a vivid picture of the abuses she had endured and the systemic flaws that had enabled them. The trial was a watershed moment. The jury, moved by Elizabeth's testimony and the clear evidence of her sanity, ruled in her favor. On January 18, 1864, Elizabeth Packard was declared legally sane, and her confinement was deemed unlawful. The verdict was not just a personal victory for Elizabeth, it was a landmark decision that exposed the dangers of a legal system that allowed husbands such unchecked power over their wives. But the battle was not over. Elizabeth Packard knew that her case was only the tip of the iceberg. She had won her freedom, but there were countless other women still suffering under similar injustices. After her release, Elizabeth Packard did not quietly return to her previous life. Instead, she became a fierce advocate for the rights of women and the mentally ill, determined to prevent others from suffering the same fate she had endured. She began writing and publishing extensively about her experiences, turning her personal ordeal into a powerful tool for social change. Her most influential work, The Prisoner's Hidden Life, a book published in 1868, detailed her experiences in the Jacksonville Insane Asylum and exposed the brutal realities of life within such institutions. The book was widely read and helped to raise awareness about the injustices faced by women and the mentally ill. It became a rallying cry for those advocating for reform. Elizabeth's advocacy extended beyond her writing. She traveled across the United States, giving speeches and lobbying legislators to change the laws that had allowed her wrongful confinement. Her efforts contributed to the passage of new laws in several states, including Illinois, which established stricter standards for involuntary commitment and required public hearings before a person could be confined to an asylum. Elizabeth Packard's case also played a crucial role in the broader women's rights movement. Her fight for legal recognition and personal autonomy resonated with many women who were also struggling against the constraints of a patriarchal society. Her story highlighted the intersection of gender, law, and mental health, and it became a symbol of the need for broader societal change. Elizabeth's work had a lasting impact. By the time of her death in 1897, she had helped bring about significant reforms in the treatment of the mentally ill and had raised awareness about the legal and social injustices faced by women. Her legacy continued to inspire future generations of activists and reformers who built on her work to push for even greater changes. Today, Elizabeth Packard is remembered as a pioneering advocate for human rights. Her courage in the face of overwhelming adversity, her relentless pursuit of justice, and her commitment to reform left an indelible mark on American legal and social history. Her story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter the personal cost. Elizabeth Packard's story is one of extraordinary resilience and courage. In a time when women had few rights and were expected to be silent, obedient, and subservient, Elizabeth refused to conform. She challenged the oppressive structures of her society, not just for her own sake, but for the sake of countless others who lacked the power or voice to do so. Her wrongful commitment to the Jacksonville Insane Asylum was a stark reminder of the dangers women faced in a society where their legal rights were virtually non-existent. But rather than being broken by the experience, Elizabeth emerged stronger, using her ordeal as a platform to fight for justice and reform. Her determination to document her experiences and to advocate for change transformed her from a victim into a pioneer for human rights. Today, Elizabeth Packard's name may not be as widely known as it should be, but her impact is undeniable. Her story serves as a powerful reminder and challenges us to reflect on the progress that has been made and the work that still remains to be done in the ongoing struggle for equality and human rights. We'd love to know what you think. Do you think you would have survived a forced commitment to an insane asylum? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're there, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And don't miss the other compelling stories being told over at Eclectic Knowledge. Well, friends, we have come to the end of another compelling story. We hope you enjoyed yourself tonight, and we hope to see you at the table again next time. Until then, my friends, may your gatherings always be eclectic and your stories compelling. Good night.